On my wedding day, I was expecting love, laughter, and the happiest moment of my life. What I didn't expect was for my mother-in-law to march into the bridal suite, shove a folder into my hands and say, "Sign this or the wedding is off." I blinked, trying to process what was happening. My maid of honor stood frozen beside me, mouth slightly open in shock. "Excuse me?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She crossed her arms, completely unfazed by my reaction. "It's a prenuptial agreement," she said with a smirk. "To protect my son. You'll sign it now or there won't be a wedding." At first I thought it was some kind of joke. Mark, my fiancé, and I had never talked about a prenup, and even if we had, this was not how it was supposed to happen. My hands trembled as I opened the folder. My eyes scanned the pages, and the more I read, the more my stomach twisted into knots. This wasn't just any prenup. This was a complete power play. The contract basically stripped me of everything. If we divorced, I would walk away with nothing, not even a penny, of what we built together. Every dime I earned would be considered family income and controlled by Mark's family. If we had children, she would have full access to them whenever she wanted, no questions asked. And the worst part? If Mark ever wanted a divorce, I had to agree to leave the house immediately, take only what I had brought into the marriage, and never ask for alimony. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so beyond insane. "You can't be serious," I said, looking up at her. "Oh, I'm very serious," she replied smoothly, shoving a pen into my hands. "Sign it." Before I could even formulate a response, the door swung open again. Mark stepped inside, his expression darkening the second he saw his mother standing there. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice sharp. His mother's tone turned sickly sweet. "Oh, nothing, dear. Just a little legal formality." She was just about to sign. Mark's gaze shifted to the folder in my hands. Without hesitation, he took it from me and started flipping through the pages. His eyes hardened, his jaw clenched, and then he ripped it in half. "His mother," gasped, her face turning red. "Mark, what are you doing?" His voice was calm but firm. "I'm not marrying a contract, Mom. I'm marrying her." Her expression twisted into pure rage. "Fine," she spat. "If she won't sign, then there won't be a wedding." And then, Mark did something that changed everything. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his own folder, and handed it to his mother. "Then I have a contract for you too," he said coolly. Her smug expression vanished instantly. Her hands trembled as she opened it, her eyes scanning the contents. The color drained from her face. She looked up at Mark in shock. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. Mark's lips curled into a smirk. "Doesn't matter," he said. "What matters is that if you don't leave this room and let us get married in peace, every single one of those documents will be made public." I had never seen his mother look truly afraid before. Angry? Yes. Annoyed? All the time. But this was panic. Without another word, she clutched the folder to her chest, spun on her heel, and stormed out. I turned to Mark, still in shock. "What was that?" He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Leverage." And at that moment I thought we had won. I thought this nightmare was over. I was wrong. For the first time in years, I thought Mark had finally put his mother in her place. She had walked out of the bridal suite, humiliated and defeated. We got married. We had our perfect moment. For the first time since meeting her, I felt safe. But the second we stepped into the reception hall, I knew it wasn't over. She was still there, sitting at the front table like she owned the place, a glass of champagne in her hand. Her eyes locked onto mine the moment we walked in, and I felt my stomach tighten. "Why is she still here?" I whispered to Mark. He exhaled sharply. "She wasn't supposed to be." I tried to shake it off. It was our night. It wasn't going to ruin this for me. So I forced a smile, greeted our guests, and tried my best to ignore the tension brewing under the surface. But my gut told me she wasn't done. And I was right. The first sign came during dinner. The waiters arrived carrying plates of food that we never ordered. Mark and I exchanged a look of confusion. This wasn't the menu we had spent months selecting. I leaned over to our wedding planner. "What happened to the filet mignon and salmon?" Her face went pale. I don't know." Let me check. A few minutes later she came back looking like she wanted to disappear. The caterer said the mother of the groom made last-minute changes this morning. She told them she was in charge. Mark slammed his fork down. Of course she did. Fine. It was just food. Annoying? Yes. But it wasn't going to ruin the night. Then came the second attack. It was time for the speeches. My maid of honor went first. She gave a heartfelt toast that had me tearing up. Mark's best man followed with a funny but sentimental speech that had everyone laughing. And then, before the DJ could move on, his mother stood up and grabbed the mic. Oh no. The entire room fell silent. She smiled sweetly, her voice dripping with fake warmth. Well, since I am the mother of the groom, I think it's only right that I say a few words. Mark muttered under his breath. Mom, sit down. She ignored him. And then she started talking. And it was bad. She spent the first 2 minutes talking about how she never thought Mark would settle down because he was so successful and had so many options. Then she turned to me. But I guess some women just know how to be persistent. Some people in the crowd laughed awkwardly, not realizing it was an insult. I clenched my fists under the table. Then she dropped the bombshell. Now, I have to admit, when Mark first told me about the engagement, I was shocked. Marriage is such a big commitment and some people rush into it without thinking. She turned and locked eyes with me. Which is why I did what any loving mother would do. I tried to protect him. But, well, he made his choice. The tension in the room was palpable. Mark stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. That's enough. She turned to him with wide, innocent eyes. Oh honey, I was just joking. He grabbed the mic out of her hand. We talked about this. You weren't even supposed to be here. She gasped, pressing a hand to her chest like she was the victim. Are you saying I'm not welcome at my own son's wedding? Mark didn't hesitate. That's exactly what I'm saying. Go home. Now. For a second I thought she might cry. But then she turned to me. And the look she gave me chilled me to the bone. Then she stormed out. For the rest of the night I tried to shake it off. The worst was over. She was gone. We could finally enjoy ourselves. I was wrong. Because the real revenge hadn't even begun yet. Our honeymoon was perfect. 10 days in the Maldives, no phones, no stress, just us. For the first time since meeting Mark's mother, I actually felt at peace. But the moment we stepped back into our apartment, that peace was shattered. The front door was locked. There was no sign of forced entry. But the second we walked inside, I felt it. Something was wrong. Mark noticed it first. The couch was missing. Not just moved, missing. Then I looked around. Half of our furniture was gone. The TV? Gone. The coffee table? Gone. Even some of our personal items. My jewelry box, Mark's laptop, framed. Wedding photos, gone. And then I saw the note sitting on the kitchen counter. Since you refused to sign a fair contract, I am simply ensuring my son is protected. You will thank me later. Your mother-in-law. I nearly passed out from sheer rage. She stole from us. Mark grabbed his phone and immediately called her. The second she picked up, he exploded. What the hell did you do? Her voice was sickeningly calm. Oh, calm down, dear. I simply took what was rightfully his. You stole from us. I protected you. Mark hung up in the middle of her sentence and immediately called the police. But when they arrived, they told us the worst possible thing. Since she had a key to our apartment, a spare she had from before we moved in, and since Mark hadn't explicitly revoked her access in writing, it would be considered a civil matter, not a break-in. I was shaking with anger. She had planned this. She knew exactly how to manipulate the system to get away with it. But what she didn't know was that Mark and I had already planned ahead. Remember that folder Mark handed her at the wedding? The one that made her face turn white? Inside that folder was every single crime she had committed over the years. Financial fraud, tax evasion, secret offshore accounts hidden from Mark's father, and the biggest one? Evidence that she had forged Mark's signature on a loan. We had been sitting on that information for months, waiting for the right moment. And she had just handed us the perfect excuse to use it. Mark gave her one last chance. You return everything you stole, apologize, and stay out of our lives. or I turn everything over to the authorities. She laughed. Actually laughed. You wouldn't dare. Mark's response? Watch me. And then he did. At first she didn't believe it. She thought we were bluffing. Then she stopped answering Mark's calls. She disappeared from social media. She went completely silent. Then a week later we found out why. Mark's father, a quiet, reserved man who had always let his wife run the show, called us. His voice was different this time. Strained. Urgent. I need to see you. Now. We met him at a diner outside of town. The second we sat down, he slid a folder across the table. You need to see this. Mark opened it. His face darkened with every page. Bank withdrawals. Asset transfers. Property deeds. His mother had drained everything. She had emptied multiple accounts, sold off assets, and disappeared. She took everything. Mark's father looked devastated. His voice shook when he spoke. She left a note saying she's starting fresh. I felt my stomach drop. She wasn't just running. She was plotting something. And then strange things started happening. Mark got an anonymous tip at work saying he had been embezzling company funds. A complete lie. Someone called my job, spreading rumors that I had faked my credentials. Packages started arriving at our apartment. Boxes filled with expired food, old shoes, and even a box of dead flowers. It didn't take long to figure out who was behind it. She wasn't just running. She was trying to destroy us. And then came the break-in. It happened on a random Thursday night. Mark and I had gone out for dinner trying to de-stress. When we got home, nothing seemed out of place. The lights were exactly how we left them. The locks weren't broken. Nothing was missing. But the second I walked into our bedroom, I saw it. A note. Sitting perfectly placed on my pillow. I will always be one step ahead of you. I screamed. Mark ran in, saw the note, and immediately checked the apartment. The windows were locked. The doors were secure. But she had been inside. That was the moment we realized. She still had a key. We changed the locks the next morning. Installed security cameras. Filed another police report. But again they said there wasn't much they could do. It hadn't stolen anything. She hadn't broken in. I was done playing defense. If she wanted war, fine. We were done playing nice. It was time to end this for good. Mark and I were done waiting for his mother's next move. She thought she could control everything, manipulate everyone, and walk away unscathed. But this time she messed with the wrong people. We had spent weeks collecting every possible piece of evidence. Fraudulent loans, tax evasion, fake accounts, even proof that she had stolen Mark's identity. And then we finally found what we needed. She had bought a house in another state under a fake name, thinking she had disappeared for good. But she made one crucial mistake. She used Mark's stolen identity to secure part of the financing. That was all we needed. Mark and I didn't hesitate. We gathered everything and made 4 calls. The IRS, the State Fraud Division, the FBI, and the local police in her new state. Then we waited. A month later it happened. Mark's phone rang while we were having dinner. He answered, his expression shifting from surprise to pure satisfaction. She was arrested? He repeated, his voice almost disbelieving. His mother had been caught. The police arrived at her new house early in the morning with federal agents. She had tried to argue, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, but the moment they showed her the documents, she lost it. She screamed, threatened the officers, even attempted to run. But when she realized there was nowhere left to go, she collapsed in a sobbing heap on her front lawn. Then in one final desperate move she called Mark. Her voice was shaking. How could you do this to your own mother? Mark didn't even hesitate. I'm just protecting myself. Isn't that what you always wanted? And then he hung up. Even after her arrest, I wasn't at peace. Mark's mother had always been a master manipulator, and I kept waiting for her to find a way out, to weasel her way through the system like she always did. But this time she had gone too far and there were too many people watching. Mark and I attended every single one of her court hearings. She showed up looking frail, pitiful, her expensive clothes gone, her once perfectly styled hair now dull and lifeless. But her eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, were the same. She refused to look at us. Her lawyer tried everything, claiming stress, misunderstandings, even playing the poor abandoned mother card. But the evidence was overwhelming. The judge saw right through her act. She was found guilty on multiple charges: identity theft, fraud, forgery, tax evasion. When the guilty verdict was announced, she finally looked at Mark, and the last thing she said before being sentenced to 6 years in prison was, "This is your fault." Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "I regret what I did." Just blame. Mark didn't say a word. He just watched as his mother was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. And that was the last time we ever saw her. You'd think that was the end, right? That she was locked away, had lost everything, and that we could move on. But there was one last move to make. While she was in prison, Mark and I worked with a lawyer to ensure she would never have control over us again. We blocked her from ever accessing our finances, we got a permanent restraining order, and the best part? Mark legally changed his last name. She lost the power to claim him as her son. It was symbolic, but it was also the ultimate slap in the face. She had spent her entire life trying to control him, to make sure he would always belong to her. Now, he was officially free. After she went to prison, the silence was almost unsettling. No surprise phone calls, no manipulative guilt trips, no unexpected visits. For the first time in years, we could just live. Mark's father, finally free from her control, started traveling the world. He even found love again, a kind, wonderful woman who treated him and us like real family. And Mark and I? We built a life that was ours. No more looking over our shoulders, no more dealing with her mind games. Just peace. Then one day years later, Mark got a letter in the mail. It was from a prison in another state. He didn't even have to open it to know who it was from. Without hesitation, he tossed it into the fireplace and watched it burn. Then he turned to me, smiled, and said, "Some contracts aren't even worth reading." And that was the end of it. For good. Mark and I were done playing defense. His mother had spent years manipulating, controlling, and getting away with everything. She had stolen from us, spread lies, and even broke into our home. But this time we weren't letting her slip through the cracks. If she wanted a war, we were ready to end it. We spent weeks digging into everything: bank records, property transfers, financial statements. At first, it seemed like she had covered her tracks well. She had emptied her accounts, sold her old assets, and disappeared into thin air. But no one is truly invisible. Especially not someone as reckless as her. Late one night, after hours of searching, we found it. A real estate transaction under a different name, but linked to a social security number that didn't exist. It wasn't hard to figure out. She had used Mark's stolen identity to secure part of the financing. She thought she had been smart, but she had made the biggest mistake of her life. That was all we needed. We gathered every piece of evidence: the fake identity, the fraudulent loan, the secret bank transfers. Then we made our moves. Call number 1, the IRS. She had been hiding money and evading taxes for years. We gave them the proof, and they were more than happy to investigate. Call number 2, the State Fraud Division. Using someone else's identity to secure a loan was a felony, and we had the documents to prove it. Call number 3, the FBI. Financial fraud across state lines? That made it a federal crime. Call number 4, the local police in the state where she had fled. We tipped them off about the warrant that was about to come her way. With everything set in motion, there was nothing left to do but wait. She thought she had run far enough, erased her past, and started over. What she didn't know was that her past was about to catch up with her, fast. The best part? She had no idea we were coming for her. Not until it was too late. A month later, it finally happened. Mark and I were having dinner when his phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, but as soon as he answered, his expression turned cold. "This is Mark." Pause. Then his grip tightened on the phone. "You got her?" I dropped my fork. My heart pounded as I watched him listen, his lips pressing into a thin line. Then he let out a slow exhale and nodded. "Thank you for letting me know." He hung up and turned to me, eyes sharp with satisfaction. They got her. I barely had time to react before his phone rang again. This time it was his father. Mark put it on speaker. "She's been arrested," his father said, his voice carrying a mix of relief and disbelief. She was at her new house when they showed up, completely blindsided. They cuffed her right in the front yard. I could practically picture it. The woman who had spent her life controlling everyone, pulling strings, and bending people to her will, standing there in shock as officers snapped handcuffs around her wrists. Mark's father sighed. She called me from jail, you know. Blamed you for everything. Mark let out a dry laugh. Of course she did. The call ended, but we knew it wasn't over. She was in custody, but people like her? They don't just give up. Sure enough, the next day Mark's phone buzzed again. This time it was a collect call from the county jail. We both stared at the screen. You gonna pick up? I asked. Mark smirked. Oh, absolutely. He accepted the call, putting it on speaker. A moment of silence. Then her voice, shaky but laced with entitlement. Mark, son, you have to fix this. He leaned back in his chair. Fix what? This is a mistake, she snapped. You know I didn't do anything wrong. Mark didn't even blink. You stole from us. You forged my name on a loan. You ran away to avoid the consequences. You did this to yourself. Her voice turned pleading. Please. I'm your mother. Mark's expression didn't change. And you always told me to protect myself, right? That's exactly what I'm doing. Silence. Then. She hissed, you'll regret this. Mark chuckled. No, Mom. You will. Then he hung up. That was the last time she ever spoke to him. But her downfall was just getting started. A month later, the trial began. Mark and I attended every single hearing, making sure she saw our faces in the courtroom. She walked in, dressed in an ill-fitting beige jumpsuit, her hair unkempt, her face pale. The woman who once carried herself like royalty now looked like a shell of herself. But her eyes, those hadn't changed. Cold. Calculating. Her lawyer tried everything. First, they claimed it was all a misunderstanding. Then they blamed stress, saying she had been overwhelmed with concern for her son's well-being. When that didn't work, they played the poor abandoned mother card, painting Mark as an ungrateful son who had turned his back on the woman who raised him. It was laughable. The prosecutor wasn't having any of it. We have documented evidence of fraud, identity theft, and financial manipulation, the prosecutor stated, stacking a pile of papers on the table. We have signed witness statements. We have bank records showing how she drained accounts and attempted to disappear. This is not an overwhelmed mother, this is a criminal. Mark's mother sat there, lips pressed into a thin line. For the first time, she had no control over the situation. Then came the real bombshell. The prosecutor pulled up a slideshow. The first image appeared on the courtroom screen, a signature. Mr. Callahan, the prosecutor said, addressing Mark, can you confirm whether this is your signature? Mark leaned forward, staring at the screen. Then he shook his head. No, that's a forgery. The prosecutor clicked to the next slide, a comparison of Mark's actual signature against the one on the fraudulent loan. It was an obvious fake. Your Honor, the prosecutor continued, this proves that the defendant not only committed financial fraud but also engaged in identity theft to take out an illegal loan in her son's name. This isn't just a case of bad decisions. This is premeditated crime. Mark's mother shifted uncomfortably in her seat. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed her face. Her lawyer tried one last desperate move. Your Honor, my client was under significant emotional distress at the time. The judge raised a hand, silencing him. Distress doesn't justify felony fraud. The final nail in her coffin came when the prosecution revealed that even after her arrest, she had attempted to access Mark's personal bank accounts from jail. She had memorized his security questions and tried to answer them through a recorded phone call. That was it. That was the moment even her lawyer gave up. The judge sighed, shaking his head. I've seen a lot in my years on the bench, but I have to say, this is a new level of audacity. Then he handed down the sentence. 6 years in state prison for identity theft, financial fraud, and forgery. The courtroom was dead silent. Then she turned her head toward Mark. This is your fault, she spat, eyes blazing with fury. Mark didn't flinch. He just stared at her as the bailiff approached. She was led away in handcuffs, her shoes clicking against the polished floor. And just like that, the woman who had spent her life controlling everyone, lost everything. You'd think that was the end of it, right? 6 years behind bars, her reputation destroyed, her control over Mark completely shattered. But there was still one last move to make. While she sat in prison, Mark and I worked with a lawyer to ensure she would never have any power over us again. We legally blocked her from ever accessing our finances, secured a permanent restraining order, and most importantly, Mark changed his last name, cutting the final tie that connected him to her. It wasn't just paperwork. It was symbolic. The ultimate rejection of everything she had tried to impose on him. She had spent her entire life manipulating, controlling, forcing Mark into her version of who he should be. Now she didn't even have the right to call him her son. And the best part? She knew it. Months passed. Life moved on. Mark and I thrived. His father, now free from her shadow, sold their old house and started traveling, finally living for himself. We built our own life, a peaceful one, free of her toxic influence. Then one day a letter arrived in the mail. It had no return address, but the second Mark saw the handwriting, he knew. She had written him from prison. I watched as he stared at it for a long moment, fingers tracing the edge of the envelope. Then, without hesitation, he walked to the fireplace, tossed it in, and watched the flames devour it. He turned to me, a slow smirk forming on his lips. Some contracts aren't even worth reading. And just like that, it was over. For good. With his mother finally locked away, Mark and I could finally breathe. But we weren't done yet. She had spent years trying to control him, manipulate him, and even sabotage our lives. Now it was time to erase every last bit of influence she had left. The first step was making sure she had no legal hold over us. We worked with our lawyer to set up financial protections, freezing any access she might have had to Mark's accounts. Any connection she once had to our assets? Gone. Then we filed for a permanent restraining order. Even when she got out, she would never be able to contact us again. No calls. No letters. No way back into our lives. And the final move? Mark changed his last name. It was the ultimate slap in the face. She had spent his whole life trying to shape him into what she wanted, but now she couldn't even claim him as her son. She had lost everything. After her sentencing, her father wasted no time moving on with his life. He sold the house she had tried to take over, packed his bags, and started traveling. For the first time in decades, he was finally free from her grasp. And Mark and I? We thrived. With her out of the picture, we rebuilt our life exactly how we wanted. We moved to a new home, doubled down on our careers, and even started planning for a future she would never be part of. For the first time in years, we weren't looking over our shoulders. Then, months later, the final message arrived. A letter. No return address. No name. But Mark knew exactly who it was from. I watched as he held it between his fingers, his expression unreadable. Then, without a single word, he walked to the fireplace, tossed it in, and watched it burn. He turned to me with a smirk. Some contracts aren't even worth reading. And just like that, the last string connecting her to our lives was gone. For good.